This is the School Success Podcast, a podcast for school leaders to learn from other school leaders what's working and what's not, and to get inspiration and encouragement, as well as strategies to grow school enrollment, connect with families, retain teachers, recruit teachers, and everything in between. You guys are heroes, and I cannot thank you enough for pouring into this next generation that's coming behind us. My goal is you will take at least one thing away from every episode that you can take back to your school to make it better than it is right now. Please enjoy the School Success Podcast. Hey, School Success Makers. Welcome to another edition of the School Success Podcast. I'm your host, Mitchell Slater, joined by a new friend out of Bellevue, Washington, Greg Forrest, who is the head of school of Summit Classical Christian School there. And I connected with him on LinkedIn. We talked, and I was like, man, I got to have this guy on the podcast. They're doing some really cool things. I got a great school, and we're going to go over kind of the same things we do with some of the other guests, going over some challenges, what's going good, get him to share some pieces of advice. And he's got a great background in education as well. So I don't want to take any thunder away from him, so I will pass it off to him to introduce himself. So Greg, welcome to the podcast, sir.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Mitchell. It's great to be here.
Awesome, man. Well, I always start off by asking the guests. I say, hey, if I was to visit Bellevue, Washington, what would we do for fun? What would you say? Mitchell, you got to do this when you come to Bellevue, Washington.
Well, you can't bring an umbrella, even though you're coming to the Pacific Northwest, and we have hit the dreary months. It was a pretty weird fall, but the rain has arrived, so we would just go enjoy outdoorsy things. We would go see some water, maybe some hiking. Depends on what time of year, but skiing, whether water in the snow. It's an amazing, amazing place to live. Super beautiful. Find some adventure is what we would do.
So definitely an outdoorsy area where if I wanted to maybe go like snowboarding, do snow sports, is there mountains close by to drive to enjoy it?
Yep, mountains, ocean, everything's within, an hour or so. So from Bellevue specifically, there's, 3 different resorts, kind of ski or snowboard resorts within an hour or so.
Okay, I'm down for that. I love snow sports, growing up in Alaska. So I miss it living here in Florida now. So if I'm ever there, I'll come in the wintertime, it sounds like. Although my wife might push back on a winter trip to Washington. But I'd love some background on you. Just real quick, kind of give me how you got to specifically where you are right now. So I'll just kind of pass it off to you for that.
Oh, yeah. So it began back in the 1900s. No. So both my parents were educators and classroom teachers and still are. And I, actually fought against being an educator. I wanted to be a dentist and work 4 days a week and make a bunch of money. And I couldn't quite fight that though. I mean, as far as being interested in wanting to be a dentist, I wanted to be a children's dentist because I wanted to work with kids. I loved kids, loved working with kids, kind of through high school and college. And ultimately, as I was kind of scanning the future horizon, couldn't fight that the best way to kind of practically impact a person's life was to educate them to be a teacher. And so I became a teacher first, and I was living in Virginia at the time. Grew up in Idaho, but went to school in Virginia and was there for 11 years. So taught in Central Virginia, just north of Charlottesville, in public schools there, and I taught 5th grade, 6th grade, and 8th grade for a few years. And one of my administrators at the time said, "Have you ever thought about administration?" And I said, "Well, yeah, because you can't support a family on teacher salary." So that, there was some encouragement from my administration as far as pursuing some leadership opportunities. So did some grad work, one through a school in Florida, and then ultimately went on to do my doctoral program through Virginia Tech, and that was in educational leadership and policy. And so, kind of worked my way up through the ranks through public schools, was an assistant principal in Campbell County, Virginia, and then ultimately about 5 years ago felt like God was calling our family to be part of a church plant here in the Pacific Northwest, specifically in Issaquah, Washington. And just felt the Lord kind of leading us and guiding us this way. So we joined a team from, I think, 4 different times across America and planted here, and the church is doing well. But moved here in the public schools, was still an assistant principal, got a few more years under my belt, and became a principal in public schools, and then ultimately landed here at Summit Classical last school year, and have enjoyed the transition. It's a whole different world, different things to navigate as a leader. But as far as the catalyst for that transition, it really feels a little bit like a career change, not just changing gears. It really feels like a career shift and change. In that, public schools, I felt like I was kind of a light, and here I'm getting to just be who I am and be really free with my convictions and beliefs. And the catalyst for that was kind of my own kids coming into school age. And so there was, some cultural things going on in public schools here in the area, and navigating that was tricky. I think I did the best I could, and really there was no issues. I miss my school that I was working at. I loved it, loved the community there. And this was also kind of the right next step for our family as far as having the staying power to be here and plant roots here. So
I love it. And you mentioned a city I haven't heard in a long time, Issaquah. I have a friend that used to live in Issaquah. So the only reason I would know that is because he lived there and I visited him. And I was like, so I haven't heard that word in a long time. And so I love that town. It was super cute. All the stuff that was there. He worked for a corporate company in Tacoma or Seattle, somewhere, whatever. So he commuted in every day. So is that where you live then?
So I live North Bend, a little bit further out. So before we were talking about the weather, where the rain clouds butt up against the mountains and dump down, that's where I live in North Bend. So that's about another 20 minutes further east towards the mountains.
Very cool. Seattle. Well, obviously you're now at a classical Christian school, and I'm assuming, like real quick, is your background in classical Christian education?
No.
Okay.
No, it's not.
It's not. So those that are listening, obviously we have different listeners. We have some Christian schools, non-Christian schools, some classical, some not, like kind of just a full range of listeners. Yeah. So those that are listening and maybe aren't very familiar with that style of education, like kind of just, I guess, the quick elevator pitch on kind of like this is what classical Christian is.
Yeah, so it's been a learning curve for me, and actually as I was coming on board, the board in the interview said, so you've not led a classical school, so how are you going to do that? And I said, well, I'm a great student and I'm going to learn and I'm going to find some wonderful mentors. So definitely have leaned on some people who have gone before me in this role and reached out to them, both where I grew up in Idaho, here locally, and then just regionally. Found some great mentors that way. But as far as, classical Christian education, it's kind of a hearkening back to what education was for, 1,500, 1,800 years. Which was really done in the liberal arts method and methodology. And so there's kind of these buzzwords that get thrown out there, but basically my perspective of classical Christian education is getting to the base of what education is, which is a spiritually formative process. And I think to parse out education of the mind apart from the whole person and the spirit of a person is just not, it's impossible to do. I mean, there is no kind of value neutral education. There is always the imparting of and passing down of values and belief systems. And so I know that in America, we try to kind of do that separation of church and state, but it's just not possible to have a value neutral education. So the classical methodology specifically kind of goes through the liberal arts. There's something called the trivium, which is these different phases of learning that cuts with the grain. So the grammar phase is basically elementary years. The dialectic or the logic phase is the middle school years, and then the rhetoric phase is the upper school years or high school age. And basically, when students are young, that first learning is the most important. And so we do a ton of jingles and chants and songs to just deeply get sticky in their brain, and they can memorize incredible amounts of information. And so we do timeline chants, and we do all these different things that just capitalize on the child's development at that age. And from a classical Christian perspective, all of those things are rooted in the truth of God. And so that's the grammar phase. Then there's the logic phase, which is where students start naturally testing boundaries. And, when I was a sixth grade teacher, I would have conversations with parents and I'd say, they'll come back in a few years, your child will return, but middle school years are kind of this unique age range. And so it's not just teaching kids, because they are all the hormones and all the things going on mentally and emotionally. It's teaching kids to think well at that phase. And so your emotions are not the arbiter of truth. Actually, there are logical fallacies, and there are times where you appeal to a false authority or appeal to emotions. And so it's teaching kids about logic. It's teaching kids how to identify truth claims and what is required of a truth claim. And so that's the logic phase in a nutshell. And then ultimately, you have this base knowledge. You are able to think well, but to communicate well, to speak well, and to write well is ultimately what the rhetoric phase is about, and kind of a culmination of all the learning that you do. So rhetoric is the good man speaking well. The good man speaking poorly is not super effective, or the bad man speaking well is just a manipulative fella. So rhetoric is all about the good man speaking well. And so there's this kind of embedded virtue development. We want to train men and women to be virtuous people. It talks about, there's this quote from a guy named C.S. Lewis. You've probably heard of him, yeah. And it talks about men without chests. So men today are ruled by their heads and their kind of guts, their passions, but we don't have men with chests, meaning men who are virtuous and stand on principle. And so, yeah, that's, I guess, in a nutshell, what classical Christian education is about. And then within that, one more layer. Within any content, there is a grammar, logic, and rhetoric phase. So if you're teaching even chemistry at the high school level, there is a fact, base level information that you have to memorize some information, and you have to do some sense making logic in there, and then ultimately you need to be able to articulate what you know. All right, I think that elevator ride is over. Sorry.
Well, I guess flip back question to that. Your kids, if they were in the public school and now in this, how was that transition for them from just regular public school now into this thing? Was it kind of like a culture shock almost for them too?
Yeah, great question. So my daughter actually has just started here this year in first grade. And so last year we had decided to homeschool her kind of in that transition period. And so we had made the decision before the shift happened, and then the shift happened, and my wife was a special education teacher. And so we said, let's just stick with our plan this year for homeschooling and then transitioning in. I will speak to that though, Mitchell, because the classical Christian movement is one that's growing across the country quite a bit. And there's a ton of startup schools going on and popping up kind of in different places. And that's always a question, of a student wanting to transfer into high school. They've never taken Latin, some of these different things. It depends on the school's makeup, but this is actually something that I want to talk about. It's going well at our school. Is we're intentionally trying to develop our programming of meeting students where they are. And so there's a learning curve, and it's never too late. And, just because a student missed the, medieval timeline jingle in fourth grade or whatever that looks like, doesn't mean that they can't come in. And oftentimes, schools have some game plans around how to do that well. Also as far as the virtue cultivation piece, we talk to our students who transfer in about it's going to be hard and it's going to be different. And just because you've never taken logic or you've never taken Latin, it's going to be a grind, but ultimately that's good for you. You're going to develop some persistence and perseverance skills that will serve you well for the rest of your life. So, it's a transition always, and by and large students come in and are able to thrive so long as they're willing to put in the work, which is the same with anything in life, right? Yeah.
Well, it sounds like that could possibly be a challenge, so it's the perfect segue into that first section. I'd love to hear some of these challenges you guys are currently up against, but not just here's the challenges, but also how are you trying to combat or go against those challenges that you guys have?
Yeah, well, that is one of them, right? Is navigating the growth and navigating the growth well. Our school's approach to the demand, and so there's lots of layers, right? The school shutdowns, COVID through the past couple of years. I don't know, they're not supposed to say that word anymore, but there was an increased demand for what we're offering because of COVID, because of how certain things were being handled from different perspectives. Also, just the cultural things that are happening here in Seattle. It's a super progressive city, and so the schools are feeling that, and kind of that was part of our family's journey, working through some of those things. So abstractly, concretely, navigating the growth of, we have more students than we have space for. And so how do I, as a school leader and working with the board and working with my leadership team, figure out, all right, we have more kids than we have space for, as a growing school and as a school that's not super, super old. We graduated 2, and then we graduated 1, and now we'll graduate 6, and then we'll graduate 13 and 20 and so on. But, rolling out one student who could pretty easily find a spot to work, and then rolling up, a class of 20 or so, there's some space issues that became an issue. So just finding the right partnerships. Real estate in Seattle, I don't know if you know this, but it's absurd and super expensive. So, our school is seeking permanence. We want to find a facility we can be in and plant roots in and partner well. Obviously, I'm in a church building right now, and that seems to be kind of the trajectory, but we're also considering all sorts of options, in the big capital campaign and buying land and doing a building from scratch. So there's that kind of concrete logistical planning, but kind of broader, more abstract is just we are different than the general stream of culture here in this area, and so we are swimming upstream in that respect, in that regard. And so swimming upstream can be difficult, and there's a G.K. Chesterton quote that says, only living things swim upstream. And so it's pretty encouraging that we are swimming upstream, against the culture, but definitely on the horizon, and I've actually spoken with some other school leaders here in the area of just the kind of balance and tension of religious freedom in comparison to how discrimination is being currently defined in the legal system, and depends on what circuit court you're in, but how that plays out in case law. And some of those things is certainly on the horizon. It's on my mind, it's on the kind of leadership team and school board's mind, just to be buttoned up policy wise, to give people notice who we are, and be really clear and articulate about that, to hedge against any litigation. But certainly that is a coming thing for private schools in the country. We've seen it in a number of higher education institutions here locally and across the country, as well as some private high schools throughout the land. So those are some nitty-gritty and also broader challenges within the scope of the coming years.
So then is it I know obviously capacity, you're at capacity, you got more students than you can kind of almost handle. Does it, when a student's interested in coming to your school, I know we sort of might talked about this, but then let's say they're 10th grade, never been in classical Christian school, coming in, is it kind of like almost where like, hey, you should probably look for another school because this is going to be almost like too much to catch in on, I guess? Or do you guys welcome them in? How's that work?
Yeah, it really is case by case. And what we want to do, a big part of the heart of our school, and really the classical, at least our perspective of the classical model, is God has given these children to a family, and he's entrusted that child to them. And what we're doing is not usurping the role of the family in the ultimate responsibility that they have to educate their child. So, back in the garden, God designed generational instruction to happen. It was fill and govern the earth, be fruitful and multiply. And that literally was before the fall, so before sin entered the world. Generational instruction and development was how God designed the world. And so that's kind of our view. Later on in the Bible, it talks about fathers training up your children in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. So God entrusted families education, and we're partnering with them in that. We're serving them in that, because I certainly can't teach an AP calculus class, but the lady down the hall can. So when a student transfers, and we actually have literally this week a family who I'm going to interview who's a 12th grader who's looking to transfer in, and it's November 1st. So that's part of the admissions process is, we want to serve your family well. We want to set up your son or daughter for success. And so sometimes it is not the right fit. And we find that through whether they do a shadow day and it's just like, this is not, this is not what the kid thought it was or what the kid signed up for, the parents are looking for. But most of the time it is, and it's something that's so drastically different than what else is out there that people are drawn to it. So I would say it's case by case basis. We want to partner with families well. We want to serve families well. And so typically, hopefully that's mutually agreed upon. There's times when it's not, and that's a little bit more of a delicate conversation. But ultimately, we want to serve and partner with families. And, if that's not the right fit, then we want what's best for that kid. And so hopefully we can message that well.
Awesome. All right, well, we mentioned challenges. We'll jump right into what's going really good, give you a chance to brag about your school, just a few things that you're like, ooh, I want to say this.
Yeah. Well, so I think that there's lots of different aspects of things that are going well. Something that I think with kind of just my background and how to, and I'll say this too, even public schools like Virginia to Washington, they were almost as starkly different in how they operated as public schools to private classical Christian school, in that leadership looked different in different contexts. And even the different public schools here, assistant principal to principal, leadership looks different depending on what your context is. So the differences between, and I'm sorry, I'm going to do a quick aside, but the differences between Virginia and Washington. So Virginia's a right to work state where there aren't teachers unions, and Washington is where there are teachers unions. And so in Virginia, the superintendent tells the principals what to do, who tells the teachers what to do, and everybody just does it. And in Washington, everything's kind of through this collective process of let's decide together. And there's honestly benefits and drawbacks to both types of systems. There certainly is an efficiency that can happen in Virginia that is not possible in Washington, but there's also bringing people along in change, right? You're a change agent as a leader. And so how do you kind of shape and cultivate the hearts and minds of your people as you lead people forward? So anyways, one thing that is going well at our school that I kind of learned through my experiences in public schools was just building the right team around you. You got to get the right people on the right seats on the bus. And so building the right leadership team out and getting the right holes filled. I feel like we were kind of right over this cusp of a critical mass of a school where it was just this kind of sweet small group of families to know we're building an institution that ideally is going to outlast all of us. And so how do we do that? Well, we need to get the right players on the right seats. We need to get the right seats on the bus. So potentially adding some roles, and that's what we've done over the past couple of years. But yeah, the team that you have around you is going to make or break your success as a leader. And so getting those right people who are not just have the right skills, but have the right disposition for leading, absolutely critical. So that's actually not anything that I was planning on saying, but it came to my mind. So anyways, so the growth is a blessing, and it's something wonderful to solve, but it is kind of a problem to solve. Our school's approach is, there's this Latin phrase that I read about, multum, non-Multa, which means much, not many. So we're not just trying to fill seats and increase our coffers. We want to grow well and maintain our vision and mission clarity, retain kind of those foundational doctrinal pieces that are distinctive for us as a school. And so we have a real clear statement of faith that we want to adhere to and have it be the statement of faith for years and years to come, while serving, a broad base of like-minded families. And so, you'll find families that have different views on all sorts of things in our school. And ultimately what's kind of our foundation and our heart of the child's been given to you, and so we're going to have your child honor you as the parents. And that manifested itself, in lots of different ways over the past couple of years. If and when there was, families who wanted masks or not want masks, like the kid whose parents want a mask, we're going to say, no, you need to wear that mask and pull it up over your nose, because you need to honor your parents, and that's what God teaches. So, having that kind of parent partnership and that clarity around who and what the heart of your school is, the scope of the role of the school, is, I think, just a real distinctive of ours, and something that's going well. Kind of also, it dovetails into our conversation earlier nicely, is, meeting the needs of students who are coming in and having this outlook of a parent partnership. We think education is a redemptive act. And so what we don't want, is certainly not my heart, is, okay, this family of three who is just like totally aligned with what we're doing as a school. And, we assess your kids, we do the family interview. 2 of your kids are great, doing well academically, and the third one has, let's say, a learning disability. Education is still a formative spiritual process. Education is still this redemptive act. We still want to partner with families. So as a school, we are working to kind of improve our programming around how we serve students with varied learning needs. And so that's actually on both ends, kind of, if you will, of the learning spectrum, whether they're high academically or low academically. Part of our mission statement talks about cultivating students who are stewards of God's gifts to them. And so we want to teach kids to know what God has gifted them in, and whether they're going to be, a blue-collar worker, a mechanic, or a doctor, or an engineer, or a stay-at-home parent. Like, we want our students to know who they are, have their identity be rooted in Christ, and ultimately be using their gifts, cultivating their gifts, and in order to glorify God, regardless of, again, what type of learner they are, whatever their multiple intelligences are. So I would say those are the things that are going well at our school. We're clear on what we're about and what we're trying to accomplish.
I love it. It's very clear, and it sounds like you got a great staff that's bought in on what you guys are doing, the vision of where you guys are going. And I didn't ask in the beginning, how old is your school at the moment?
Yeah, so we started in 2006, so 16 going on 17 years this year, and it started with just, I think, a handful of kids, and has grown. We're over 220 this year, so I anticipate we'll continue growing. So,
but you're at capacity with the church building that you guys rent then?
Yeah, so interestingly, we did a campus move last year, and so I got hired kind of late in the season, started July 1st, went and visited some family on the East Coast July 2nd, and then flew back after a week or two. And the day after that, it was a campus move day. So we moved a little bit closer to the mountains, like I mentioned, out in Fall City, to Bellevue. And then, there's the occupancy and all those building usage type things through the city that we had to go through. And so last year, kind of as soon as we got in, I mentioned we had one senior last year. I started kind of looking around, doing the math, and we had some larger spaces that were kind of shared between two classes, and it was certainly less than ideal. So we actually split off to a second campus this year. And so, yeah, we have capacity now for growth for a few more years, and really looking for that long-term permanent or semi-permanent, building or partnership that we can lock into for years to come.
But you guys are an independent, not associated with an actual church, like a sending church or anything?
Yep, exactly. So we were at a church before, had been there for a number of years, had some different kind of spin-off sites there close to where we were on our campus. And yeah, we are not affiliated with one specific school. We have, I think, something like 40 or 50 schools or churches represented at our school.
Awesome, man. Well, I love what you guys are doing, and I love, obviously, that you're there leading them. So to kind of slowly wrap it up, I always end with the same question. It's just giving you a chance to share a piece of advice. It can be whatever you want it to be, but what would that piece of advice be from Greg?
Oh man, I was thinking about this, and it was, I think your first learnings are your most important ones. And so what I was actually, again, this is not what I was thinking about originally, but I think what I wanted to, and still kind of intend to talk with some of our high school students about, is just ownership of the school and owning the space that you're in, not necessarily the physical space, but it's something that I learned early on as a leader is you just need to own things. And it is hard to own other people's mistakes, and you don't always have to, honestly. I mean, it's really easy to deflect certain things that you don't want to deflect, but I think the strongest leaders own mistakes and provide coverage for their people, not to the extent that it's not appropriate to hold people accountable, but to have ownership of every aspect of what you should be owning is just hugely important for leaders. And then there's also accountability for folks, and that's the harder part of that. If you can own a problem, or at least outwardly facing own a problem, but there still needs to be growth and learning kind of amongst your team or amongst whoever it is that you might be owning a problem for or from or shielding from. But anyways, that's a small example, but my job is not doing facilities stuff. And yet, for a bulk of last year, I was here with the facilities, kind of point person, setting stuff up, tearing stuff down, doing the cleaning. Early on, we onboarded a new person with that, and I walked around with them as we were kind of doing the training and figuring stuff out, and cleaned some toilets with them. And so, there was this guy who just shared leadership stuff during college, and he said, it's not about titles, it's about towels. Like, just serve the people around you, because they'll see that, and that will let people know that you are not in it for living in a glass palace, but in it for the mission and the vision of what you're doing and accomplishing. And I think that mission clarity and vision clarity is absolutely essential for any organization. So know what you're doing and who you're doing it for and what the whole is that you're feeling. But ultimately, leadership is not for the faint of heart. When I was in Virginia, I think it was some director who was a kind of a tangential supervisor said something that school leaders make impactful people impacting decisions every 4 minutes or something like that. And that about rings true. You are making impactful decisions that impact people's kids, which is really, really important to them, very frequently. And so what I try to advise, particularly kind of new teachers or new school leaders, is think about being on the other end of this conversation, whether it's an email or a phone call or whatever that is. But we are on that child's team, whether they're in trouble or not. We are on that family's team, whether we agree with the perspective they're coming with or not. And so I think when you take that stance and when you take that approach of you're on the family's team, you're on the kids' team, hard conversations just are easier. And it doesn't mean that there's not ugly or hard parts of the job, doesn't mean that it's not a grind. People are messy and people are flawed, and we are too as leaders. And so I guess that's advice I would have. And I don't know if that was very succinct at all, but love your people well, operate with grace, understand the scope of what you're doing. And education, again, from my perspective, is not just a superficial, I'm gonna fill your head with some numbers and reading skills. It really is this imparting of life and culture, and what is it that we are trying to accomplish? What does human flourishing look like? If you can answer that question in your school, what does human flourishing look like? That will kind of move you forward with, then what are we trying to accomplish? So
good, man. I love it, and I agree with you. And one of the biggest pieces I got out of what you just said was giving you're talking about the high school kids, giving them ownership. And I think it's so incredibly important and valuable, and something that they're going to remember for a long, long time of that school believed in me when I was quote unquote a kid or student, however you want to say it, and gave me ownership over whatever this area is, or over what to oversee or to pour into younger students that are younger than me. That will go on forever, of giving them ownership. So that was the biggest piece I got out of that last one, which I loved and agreed with. So any final thoughts before I close this out?
Go enjoy the sun, man. That's not fair, but it's cool.
Cool, man. Well, I will enjoy the rainy, cold. As we're recording this, I don't know when this one will actually launch. I know that we're entering November now, so the holidays are fast approaching. So obviously enjoy that with your family, and wishing you and your school nothing but the best, man, as you continue to grow and to educate that next generation that's coming behind us. Sounds like you guys are doing everything right from the outside looking in on what you guys are doing. I think they got the right man in charge to get you guys there. And yeah, man, wishing you guys nothing but the best. So thank you for your time today, Greg.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thank you for having me on, Mitchell.
Well, I know I just said it, but I'll say it again. A huge shout out and a thank you to Greg for taking time and being on the podcast today. I love what he's doing there in Washington. I'm wishing them nothing but the best as they continue to grow that school and educate the next generation that's coming behind us. And I do hope they're able to get a new building built maybe here in the next few years as they are continuing to grow, as he mentioned, and they just get flooded with more and more students there in Washington because they're doing some really, really cool things. If you're a school listening to this episode and you're like, man, I want to grow my school, I need help filling those empty seats that are in my school, we'd love to hear from you because we'd love to help you fill those. You can check us out online, schoolsuccessmakers.com. That's schoolsuccessmakers.com. And if you're more of a Facebook user and you'd rather just kind of be around a community of school leaders, you can join our private Facebook group called School Success Makers. That's School Success Makers on Facebook, private group just for school leaders. I'd love to personally see you in there. We'll be here next time with another amazing guest as usual on the School Success Podcast. We'll see you then.